My name is Troy. Reese Black, my brother, is with me today, and this is Filibusted. And the European leaders want a ceasefire before serious negotiation talks with Russia can continue. But what we're seeing now is that Donald Trump is flipping the script on them. They've called for ceasefires again and again as if that's something that has to happen before we can continue negotiations with Russia. French President Macron, as well as German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, both have reiterated this week in meetings with Trump their position. In this moment here in this video, Reese, if this is the correct one, if you want to pull that back up, Merz is basically saying that Russia must agree to a ceasefire now, or else we're not going to talk to them about further negotiations involving ending this conflict. But Reese, let's dive into what is Trump doing and what angle is he bringing to this narrative that's completely different from what all the European leaders are saying. And we also have seen this pattern before, and how has it worked out?
Yeah, so immediately after Merz states that position, saying we have to pressure Russia into a ceasefire, and there's no way we can have further serious negotiations with Russia about ending the war in Ukraine without having a ceasefire first. In this clip right here that I have up on the screen, Trump immediately disagrees with Merz in that moment. He turns around, he kindly, gently pushes it away from the ceasefire conversation. On this one, it's not much of a confrontational moment, but he does immediately disagree with him. And instead, he focuses on opening lines of communication with Russia, and right now beginning serious negotiations to make a comprehensive peace deal. People should maybe be aware of this, but during these meetings that took place just this week, he also, during the middle of it, Trump got Putin on the phone and talked to him during the middle of these conversations, and then came back and got Zelensky to agree to meet with Putin in person. And so that's what you see, that him pushing for that. So immediately, like I said, he disagrees. Wow. He says, we don't have to have a ceasefire in order to open up the terms of negotiation. And it's also later on, beside when they're not right here on this table, there's a clip later where they're answering questions by the press. Trump makes his position very clear about the ceasefire and whether or not we need a ceasefire before we can open up negotiations. And I'm just going to read from one of his quotes to let Trump speak for himself here, because I think he lays it out really well. But he says, "I don't think you need a ceasefire. You know, if you look at the 6 deals that I settled this year, they were all at war. I didn't do any ceasefires, and I know that it might be good to have it, but I can also understand strategically why, well, you know, one country or the other wouldn't want it. You have a ceasefire and they rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and you know maybe they don't want that. But if you look at the 6 deals that we made peace and, you know, long-term, long-running wars, I didn't do any ceasefires." So he's talking about the 6 deals of, we talked about this on the Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize episode we just did, the 6 deals that he cut recently. And we're going to get into that because one of those technically is actually just a ceasefire, Trump and Pakistan. So Trump is being a little misleading with his wording here, that he didn't do any ceasefires, but he is making it clear with this situation here between Russia and Ukraine, with the European leaders saying we have to have a ceasefire first. And he jumps right in. He continues and he says, "I like the concept of a ceasefire for one reason, because you'd stop killing people immediately as opposed to in 2 weeks or in 1 week or whatever it takes. But you can work a deal where we're working on a peace deal while they're fighting. They have to fight. I wish they could stop. I'd like them to stop, but strategically they could be a disadvantage for one side or the other." Talking about Ukraine and Russia, obviously. But all these deals I made without even the mention of the word ceasefire. So that's his response, and that's his take on, do we need a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia before we can continue opening lines with Russia, before we can make a comprehensive peace deal? Absolutely not. Let's make a peace deal right now. Of course, and this is worth mentioning. Trump is the only leader involved in this whole situation that has sat down and met with Putin face to face, discuss peace and discuss pushings, and then also push Zelensky and Putin to agree to a talk, which hasn't occurred yet, but he's pushing them into a talk. And so you see him pushing for this comprehensive peace plan, trying to work it out with Russia, instead of imposing a ceasefire first demand on Russia, saying we must have a ceasefire first. So this must happen first before we can have any more talks, which in my opinion would actually only delay negotiations. And we'll get into that more in a little bit. But I think there is an argument to be made that sometimes that response that of we have to have a ceasefire before we can do anything else actually pushes back peace and pushes back comprehensive peace plans, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But let's talk about Zelensky's opinion on ceasefires, because I think this is actually really fascinating. But I think before we get into that, we have a message from our sponsor.
Investing can be confusing and scary, but it doesn't have to be. Genesis Gold Group takes the guessing out of the game and guides you on your gold investment journey. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections, kind of like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer high security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there, 100% owned by you. So don't wait to get started. Visit filibustedgold.com today for a free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group.
Thank you, Genesis Gold Group, for our sponsorship today. Troy, do you have any comments on Trump's take on this on ceasefire before I get into Zelensky's opinion?
Yeah, my main thought is I think it's interesting. Like you said, one of Trump's, I watched the the White House press briefing with Caroline Leavitt earlier today, where she was responding to the media's response mainly to Trump's meeting with Putin. And she was trying to correct the narrative, right? And I think she did a very good job at doing that. But she highly stressed his 7-piece deals in 7 months, and she's talking about the 6 that you're talking about. And obviously she's putting this one into kind of counting the chickens before they hatch, right? She's putting this one into the basket.
Right.
But one of the things that I think is very interesting is that Trump is coming at it from such a different angle. And I'm questioning the narrative now and saying, why do the European leaders want, and I understand that it's like they want the fighting to stop right away, and that's a good reason, but why do they need the ceasefire to stop in order to negotiate peace? It's almost like they don't want the war to end. I don't know if that's a appropriate question to ask or not, but I'm just saying it doesn't seem like they're coming at it from the best angle. And I feel like if you look at Trump's pattern, even though one of his peace deals was a ceasefire, like you said, if you look at the pattern, it seems to be working, so maybe let's listen to what Trump has to say and watch what he's doing and not listen to the European leaders so much. That's my thought.
Yeah, Trump definitely does have a better track record so far for this year when it comes to stopping fighting. And so I do think the European leaders should probably lean into his leadership a little bit on this one. And it's kind of bizarre. And he goes back to the Biden administration. He, unlike Trump, he cut ties and he cut all lines of communication with Russia. And the European leaders, they kind of just followed suit and did the same. And so if you think about, are you actually ever going to be able to come to some sort of peace agreement with a nuclear power that you refuse to even talk to and be like, no, Russia's so bad and so awful and Putin is so evil that we're not even going to talk to him. It's like, okay, well then you have removed peace from the table. And that's what Biden did. He cut ties with Russia to not be able to talk. And of course, there has to be some like narrative correction stuff when Trump invites Putin to come, because everybody that hates Russia and everybody that doesn't like Trump is like, oh, this is terrible. How could he speak to this person and in person? Which again, it's like, do you want peace or do you want to kind of bluster and be like, oh, we're on the side of Ukraine. We don't like Russia because this evil thing that they're doing. And we demand a ceasefire, but then never actually get to peace.
And I would add to that, not only is Trump willing to actually talk to Russia, whereas former President Biden was not willing to do that. A lot of the European Union, European leaders, they're not willing to talk to Russia. Certain things have to happen before they're even willing to negotiate. He's talking to Putin, but he's also talking to the leaders on the other side and trying to get them on board with a solid plan. Right. In her address at the White House earlier today, Caroline Leavitt said, while y'all were sleeping in your beds, Trump was awake last night or the night before at 2 a.m. in the morning on a call with a bunch of presidents and leaders from Europe, trying to get them on the same page about what's happening right now and pushing for peace. He's staying up halfway through the night to get this thing done. And you don't see anybody else in the world doing that right now.
Yeah, it is crazy. And there's definitely place for a false narrative where you have the European Union pushing for a ceasefire and Trump being like, oh, no, we don't need a ceasefire. Because if you take that at face value, you might be like, well, the European Union, they want people to stop being killed. And Trump is like, we don't need a ceasefire, because that sounds kind of bad if you take it. But if you look at it from the whole strategy and seeing that he's actually the only one who's actually pushing the ball forward into legitimate peace talks and legitimate negotiations. But let's get into the further dealings with the ceasefire and why I think it's not worth pushing for a ceasefire. And we can kind of see this actually in Zelensky's opinion. I think this is it's kind of humorous. It's kind of interesting. We'll get into it and see in the comments what people think about Zelensky and his true motivations here. But I just thought this was really interesting so Zelensky has been squarely in the same camp as the European leaders. So whatever the European leaders are saying, that's what he's saying. So he's definitely on the side of them, publicly and what he's saying. So they are pushing for a ceasefire. And so he's like, okay, yeah, let's do a ceasefire. If that's something that needs to happen before we have serious talks with Russia. He's pretty much just in the same boat as them at all times. However, so he is, he's been stated as saying, yeah, let's have a ceasefire. However, he also has stated things that show that he basically strongly believes a ceasefire with Russia is completely worthless. So first up from this past meeting, Zelensky said after, Trump got on the call with Putin and got off the call with Putin, Zelensky said just this week that he's ready to meet with Putin in person. If Trump can set up a meeting with the two of them, he will do it, right? And he did not say that was dependent on having a ceasefire first. So he's willing to meet with Putin, even if there's no ceasefire in place. So Zelensky doesn't seem to be of the opinion that you have to have a ceasefire before you can talk to Putin. If Trump set it up, he's claimed that he's willing to do it. So we'll see if that happens. It's probably likely that it will. But secondly, everyone might remember this little episode here. This was from back in February, the massive blow up that happened at the White House between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this shouting match that occurred. But this was an interesting conversation because during this fight, essentially what occurred is Trump mentioned Ukraine trying to take more diplomatic routes and being more diplomatic with Russia, and everyone trying to be more diplomatic with Russia, essentially. And he mentioned that Ukraine should take a ceasefire if Russia offered a ceasefire. So you see here, of course, Trump is not completely opposed to any sort of ceasefires. He hasn't been in the past, but he says he pressured him, saying we need to be more diplomatic. If Russia offers a ceasefire, you need to take it. And Zelensky's response to that is, we don't just need a ceasefire. We've done that before. Putin violated it 25 times, including during your presidency, Mr. President. That's a direct quote. Also, during that argument, as Trump was trying to push for diplomacy, including the possibility of a ceasefire, Zelensky repeatedly was basically saying that Russia breaks the ceasefires every time, and there's no point for ceasefires. And he made it very clear in this conversation and the things that came out during the heat of the moment. I think he made it very clear that he truly thinks that ceasefires are not worthwhile at all. And the only thing he was pushing for that he thinks is actually worthwhile is security guarantees from the United States and Europe. So that's what's worthwhile to him. He wants Europe and the United States to say, yeah, if Russia crosses this line or whatever, we're going to come down on Russia. Of course, he's called for that all the time. He's basically, if Zelensky had his way from some of the things he said before, the United States would be bombing Russia right now if Zelensky completely
right, and they'd also be in NATO as well if he had his way.
Right, and he would get like they would be in NATO, and NATO, the NATO world would be basically in a full-out war with Russia if Zelensky completely had his way, because he wants absolute total security guarantees, and he's made that very clear in this one. If ceasefire is worthless, he just wants the United States to promise, full security guarantee. So that was an interesting conversation. But even though Trump and Zelensky are on very different sides, you can see how they both kind of agree. And they kind of agree against the European Union leaders who are saying we need a ceasefire before anything else. And both Zelensky and Trump are kind of saying the same thing in a way, which is ceasefires are worthless. They're saying it from two completely different angles, but they are both saying that the ceasefire, we don't need a ceasefire. Ceasefire is basically worthless. And to reiterate this point, of course, both Russia and Ukraine have accused each other countless times of violating all these ceasefires. We've had 17 ceasefires since 2014 between Russia and Ukraine. And so again, with the European leaders saying we need another ceasefire, we've had 17 of these
They
things.
just want it to keep going on.
And it has been, they violated them, either Russia or Ukraine or both. You can dig into that yourself and who's more guilty. But they both violated them for sure. Probably, if I had to guess, Russia's probably violated them more than others. Don't quote me on that. Do your own research. But they've had 17 ceasefires, and every single one of them has been violated. And of course, the problem is, and which Trump pointed out in his quote, talking about how no side wants to stop the fighting, while you're just doing a temporary ceasefire. The problem is they both want this occupied territory. This here in the red is the occupied territory that is Ukraine and Russia has occupied now, including Crimea down there. And the problem is, at any point, if you call a ceasefire, we know that those ceasefire borders can turn into basically semi-permanent borders now of like, we call it a ceasefire. If it doesn't get resolved, well, wherever my troops are, we have that land now. And Russia's made it very clear they want to annex this whole region. And Ukraine has made it very clear they don't want to give any territory to Russia. And so neither side has any incentive to actually stop the fighting if it's just a ceasefire that's in place. And so those ceasefires, even if they stop shooting at each other momentarily, both sides are constantly trying to get the upper hand and be able to position themselves in a place. And this is for lots of ceasefires. I'll get into a couple here in a second, but that's just kind of the problem with ceasefires. You keep trying to call for a ceasefire as if it was pushing something. Yeah, people might stop dying for a week or two, but the problem is it doesn't stop the two sides from trying to get what they want and keep pushing what they want and repositioning themselves and build back up in order for the fighting just to break out again in a couple of weeks, And so in that way, ceasefires don't really accomplish much. And I have weapon. You want to comment on that?
Well, let's jump into some of the examples, to back up that, because you're saying ceasefires are not really that helpful. And I think maybe there's a rare case where they are, where both sides really want to stop fighting, and and they got into the skirmish or the fight for reasons other than what we're seeing here, but in this case, it doesn't seem like it's going to help. And we're about to show some of those examples, I know. But at the same time, people are pushing this narrative saying, well, Trump is against a ceasefire, so he doesn't care that people are dying. And yet Trump himself is the one who's pushing for the permanent peace and the end of the war, not just a temporary ceasefire. And I think what you're about to bring, Reese, these examples really make that point strong. So let's look at some of these.
Yeah, so look at a few examples. And the point being here, I think that you're right. Ceasefires obviously can be useful, but the more times a ceasefire gets called for a conflict, and the more times the conflict's gone on, and the ceasefire continues to be called and then happens and gets broken, each time the ceasefire becomes less and less useful, obviously.
Right.
So in this case, the Russia-Ukraine, they've had 17 ceasefires in the last 10 years. At this point, a ceasefire is completely worthless for them. And so let's get into, here's a country that has had some ceasefires of sorts in the past, and they're currently in a ceasefire situation. Iran versus Israel, they are in a ceasefire right now. However, Iran here has a military advisor saying, what is the quote here? We are not in a ceasefire. We are in a stage of war, is what he says. Iranian military advisor. So he just straight up claims, we have technically called a ceasefire, but we're literally just sitting over here biding our time and rebuilding and getting ready for the next thing they're going to do. And so the United States, Israel,
it's like that picture of going down into the trench and reloading your musket, like that's what it is. Yeah.
It's just a reloading moment. Yeah. Everybody is expecting Israel and Iran to break out fighting again at any moment. Right. And so this is a ceasefire. The ceasefire between Iran and Israel is completely worthless. And again, it goes back to what do the countries want? And unfortunately, as we know from Iran, they want the absolute destruction of the Israeli state. And so that's not, I don't know where the middle ground is between that, Israel existing and absolutely destroying Israel. So that's an unfortunate situation I'm making light of right now, obviously. But this is just an example of the international community will push for, okay, ceasefire, but it doesn't ever get to the root issue of why the conflict is occurring. And so the fighting, of course, will inevitably break out. This is one we did an episode of just the other day, or a few months back, actually, India and Pakistan. This is one of the ones, of course, that Trump credits himself for brokering, and Marco Rubio and other people, of course, were involved in it as well. And it was great. It was great to broker this ceasefire. A lot of people could have died if they hadn't, and it's lasted for the last few months. However, as I talked about, or the United States, of course, is eyeing them right now because there is a lot of reasons to think that they're just going to break out fighting again. India and Pakistan have I think it's the most highly militarized border between any two countries.
That's right.
And we did a whole episode on this. If you're curious about this, we published this one right after the India-Pakistan 3-day war was called for a ceasefire. And it's called The Real Reason the India-Pakistan War is Far From Over. And in it, I explain the many reasons, including water, that they are fighting over. They're fighting over the water that runs through this occupied region. And that's the region that they're fighting over. And the water goes into both countries. And whoever has the source determines all the water for both countries. And
That was
so
a
that's where
solid episode, man. That was a
Huh?
solid episode. Yeah,
Yeah, it was a
that was
great
good
episode. The very, very informative episode. I did a lot of research on that one, learned a lot about the two countries and their decades and decades of conflict. But this is, again, a situation where the ceasefire is nice because now no one's dying at this exact moment. But both sides are literally, again, still vying for control over the water. And unless a more comprehensive peace plan is nailed down, they break out fighting every few years. So there's no reason to think that there's isn't just going to break out fighting again. The last example, this one's a little different, but the last example of calls for ceasefires and just pointing out how unhelpful it can be and how it's just a common thing you see in the international community pushing for ceasefires, but does it really actually lead to long-term peace? Of course, is the push for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And the international community has been pushing this for the longest time. And Hamas recently, I think they've accepted this several times, but Hamas has basically always been on board for, yeah, let's have a ceasefire. The only problem is the difference between like some of these other conflicts between more legitimate countries is Hamas is a full-blown terrorist organization with the stated goal of completely destroying Israel and killing all the Jews, and they do not have any real interest for creating a country, creating a solid nation, a solid country that they can actually govern. Hamas does not have any ability to do any sort of governing because its whole ideology is a death cult ideology bent on destroying the Jews. And so when the Hamas says, yes, let's do a ceasefire, sounds great, what they're saying is we want Israel to stop shooting at us so that we can recoup and replan our next terrorist attack, because every attack that they've done on Israel is not on military installations like the October 7th attack. That wasn't a military installation. That was them coming in and literally just murdering citizens, as many citizens as they could during a music festival. And so to say that Hamas is going to accept a ceasefire literally just means I want international community coverage to basically squash Israel for me for a little while and keep them off our back so that I can recoup and we can come back and launch another terrorist attack. They don't have any legitimate nation state goals, even if you hate Russia, you could at least say that Russia has some clear goals that they're trying to get, security and a border zone for their nation, and they're afraid of NATO and all these different things. Or maybe they just want more land from Ukraine because Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of things you could say, you could clear cut. They're not just there because they want to kill as many Ukrainians as they can kill. Not the same situation. So this is one of the worst calls for ceasefires that we see all the time. It's like, this is not getting to the root of the issue and won't actually have be a solution for peace long term.
Yeah.
But I understand it. I mean, my last thoughts on ceasefires is obviously ceasefires can be a good thing. I have a high value for life. I want more lives to be preserved rather than killed, obviously. But I just think we have to be realistic about their uses and what actually leads to long-term peace. And something that Trump has pushed for, which people have understood for years and years, and it's just like we've forgotten recently, is that the way to maintain peace is to have constant, open means of communication, especially between nuclear powers. And so it's good to see that Trump had a conversation with Putin, and we no longer have that kind of embargo on, and nobody gets to talk to Russia. Because even in the Cold War, I mean, the president of Russia and the president of America always had, a direct line, like a red telephone where they could pick up and talk to the person at any time. And basically, if it wasn't for that telephone, like, we probably would have had nuclear fallout, by then. And so I'm glad to see that Trump is not imposing artificial standards of like, we must have a ceasefire first before we talk to anybody. So that's how I think he has definitely changed the situation, and is leading the situation a little bit better than the European leaders are at this moment.
I agree, Reese. And I think when you said imposing an artificial guideline, I think that's really what it is. And it could be related to ego. It could be related to pride. well, we need Russia to do this before we're willing to do this, and it just sounds like a pride issue where someone's not willing to move the boundary line. They're not willing to move the border line, in their mind. And I think Trump is obviously, he's getting creative, he's working around that issue. He's getting creative with it. You said it earlier. In the middle of his meeting with Zelensky, he takes a break to go call Putin and say, hey, will you meet with this guy? Can we set up a three-way, meeting? Nobody else is willing to do that. He's up at 2 a.m. in the morning, calling European Union leaders, and saying, is there anything we can do to bring this to a close? And it's just a lot more creative than what we've seen some of the other leaders who have been semi-involved doing. And it's a lot more creative than the narrative they've been pushing. And I'm hoping that it works. Praying for the best.
Absolutely hoping that it works. Trump has a decent track record, obviously, from this year for solving conflicts. And so, yeah, just praying and hoping that it works. And we can't know everything, but it does seem to be a better strategy than what has been deployed as late. And so, yeah, hoping for the best. Thank you for everyone for joining in. And I hope you'll catch us again on tomorrow's live stream, where Doug will be being the host for the next one. So,
all right, we'll see y'all next. Gold is not just a backup plan if the world falls apart. It's an investment opportunity that could set you up for generations. There's never really a bad time to invest in gold, but you want to make sure you have the right guide. And that is where Genesis Gold Group shines. Whether you are a first-time buyer or a seasoned investor, their trusted expertise and competitive pricing makes them an easy choice. They offer tangible assets in case of emergencies, but they can also design the perfect IRA just for you. And they'll even cut through all that confusing red tape from the IRS. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer a more high-security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there and 100% owned by you. Genesis Gold Group is a safe, simple, and convenient way to invest. Visit filibustedgold.com today for your free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group.